today, the biggest question I get as a climate scientist is, what can I do about it?
What you know about your neighborhood can really help to have these conversations about how we can make our neighborhoods more resilient.
It begins.
I wanna fly, can you take me far away? Give me a star.
Climate change, all of this is science.
And I'll go so
El Nino is coming.
How will rising sea levels impact air travel?
touch the ground.
How can youth make big changes in their community that help relieve the effects of the climate crisis?
That all fly.
And that is our Center for the Environment, and we'll see programming all year long from that. And in a year and a half or so, a little bit less, there will also be amazing programming in our new Public Science Common, which will become the finest public science convening space in the world. So keep coming to the museum and learning more. But now to Sing for Science. This is the creation of Matt Whyte, who is a great friend of the museum, who is an acclaimed musician himself. And Sing for Science is in the top 10 music interview podcasts on Apple's list. And during this time, Matt will explore the connection between science and music, or perhaps more specifically between musicians and what they care about in science. And it's been a special thing to have him here. It'll be special to hear from Neko Case. And now, everybody, please welcome Matt Whyte. I forgot one other thing. I always forget this. If you want to ask a question, you should go on Slido.com. You can see it, Slido.com, or you can use this QR code, and it's #SingForScience, okay? Slido.com. One of these days, I'm not going to forget that, but not today. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Yes, Sing for Science is a podcast, but these days it is as much an event series. And I think it's important to note that it's one whose home is probably right here, not just in Boston, but at the Museum of Science more than any other city where I host these tapings. So I consider it no small matter of prestige to partner up with you guys. So thanks again, Tim and James, for the incredible job they do in putting these on. Yeah, why not? So for those of you who are not familiar with my show, I'll give you a little bit of background how I ended up here. I'm a musician, and I started it because it had occurred to me how over the course of my life, music had so often been a bridge to other things that may not have had anything to do with music, be it new ideas, new people, new experiences. And so with that in mind, when I first became acquainted with hostility not just towards science, but to expertise, higher learning, knowledge systems, I had this idea. I thought, well, what if I bring a musician together with a scientist and they have a conversation about one of the musician's songs through the lens of science? Could then a fan of the musician listening not just walk away with a new piece of knowledge, but maybe for them, just maybe, science, higher learning, higher education would not be as alienating, it might be more accessible. And so, just to give you some idea of what this looks like in practice, these are some examples of past episodes I've done. So we had the singer of Korn, the heavy metal band Korn, you may be familiar with them. They have a song called Dead Bodies Everywhere. So we had, of course, he wanted to talk to a mortuary science expert. So that was Jonathan Davis. The pop star Sia came on, and she talked about one of her many breakup ballads with an attachment theory psychologist. If you were here last year, we had both David Byrne and Jack Antonoff at the museum. And tonight, our conversation with Neko Case and Rebecca McMackin will fall under what I call the labs format. And so I created the labs format where it's not necessarily married to any song, we're just talking about one topic of shared interest. And it seems relevant to share a little inside baseball information with you that David Byrne forced my hand to start this spin-off because when we invited him here to talk about river eel ecology, I said, David, wouldn't it be incredible if we could tie this conversation to the Talking Heads cover of Take Me to the River? To which he said, no, thank you. I'd prefer to just talk about eels. So now we have this format, and we can proceed unencumbered by my rigidity. One piece of housekeeping. No shame. I see some of you have already helped yourselves to the free merchandise. That is fine. But typically what we do is we scan this here QR code if you want to get out your phone. I've got a couple very small hoops for you to jump through. You sign up for the newsletter, give a review, you get the merchandise. I will be over there after the show. So again, thank you so much to Tim, to James, to the museum for having me. Thank you to the Simons Foundation for their generous support of my show. Most of all, thank you to all of you for supporting a really important institution like this and coming out for unique programming like tonight's event. So this is where we start our podcast. This is Sing for Science Labs. I'm your host, Matt Whyte. Each episode in this series brings together artists and science to explore a shared topic of interest. Today's topic is horticulture science, and our guests are singer-songwriter Neko Case and ecological horticulturist Rebecca McMackin. Neko Case is a trailblazing musician with roots firmly planted in both punk and country music. Her work as a solo artist and as member of the New Pornographers has earned her a reputation for blending raw emotional honesty with a deep reverence for the natural world. In her recent memoir, The Harder I Fight, The More I Love You, Neko offers an intimate glimpse into the enduring bond she's forged with nature throughout her life. A connection that also comes through in her Instagram feed and Substack Entering the Lung, where she often shares images of her garden and her devotion to land stewardship on her rural Vermont homestead. Rebecca McMackin is an ecological horticulturist and writer and currently serves as the lead horticulturist for the American Horticulture Society. Formerly the director of horticulture at Brooklyn Bridge Park, Rebecca is known for championing wild, more biodiverse urban landscapes. In her TED Talk, Let Your Garden Grow Wild, she advocates for working with, not against nature, creating habitats that support pollinators, birds, and resilient plant communities. Her work merges science and design to reimagine how cities and people can embrace a more ecological way of living. Museum of Science, please help me welcome to the stage Neko Case and Rebecca McMackin.
Hi, Matt.
Okay. How was that intro?
It was really good.
Oh,
You did a great job.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
So many of us, this is where some visual aids will come in handy here. Many of us are familiar with your relationship to gardening through your posts on social media. Now, you're a very prolific photographer. These are photographs that I've pulled from your Instagram from the last 5 years with anything vaguely green. And
I was busy. Wow.
yeah. And, you know, in the business, we have what we call a confidence monitor, so you can look at that if you don't want to cream your... Now, I've done my best to curate here. This is, these are some close-ups, and so at any point, I can't identify any of these flowers, but both of you can, so we can, throughout our conversation, refer to these. But we have, just to give us, for ease of reference, I have your close-ups, I have your little pollinator friends, and my favorite, your Nature is a Handsome Son of a Bitch series.
It
so
really
it's
is.
Yeah, kind of like nature, art in nature kind of thing. So if you would, could you provide some commentary to any of those that we've just shown and give a glimpse of your gardening life?
Well, there's some really nice delphiniums in the upper left. They all died. And that didn't come back this year, but I had them all for about 10 years, and they just said no more. And then there's some calendula, there's a poppy, and then on the right side, there's a gray poppy with a bunch of other pollen in it from another plant. And the little star-shaped one under the orange calendula is an unopened, menopause makes me not remember words sometimes. But my brain is sharper than ever, but my mouth is not.
Balloon flower.
Thank you. Balloon flower. And then I think I'm just so in love with colors of things, and so I often just take pictures of color because I can't help
I don't
it.
know. You can't see the text. You see in the top left. The blue that sometimes occurs in nature makes me breathe different, like I'm a better kind of creature. So yeah, it's like, nature is really good at orange. That's another piece of text.
Yeah, nature is fantastic at orange. I can't quite replicate it myself, unfortunately.
So how did you start your relationship to gardening to become as intense as it is now?
My gateway drug plant was tomatoes. I started growing tomatoes when I lived in Tucson, Arizona, and I did it because my whole life growing up, we always had a garden, and it wasn't a weird thing to eat things out of the yard. And, you know, all the older members of my family all had gardens and farms, and I remember a lot of eating peas off the vine and many varieties of things. Like there would be 10 different kind of peas rather than one kind of pea, and those things have all kind of shrunk down over the years to a more homogenized choice. And so I started growing tomatoes, and I noticed that I felt different after I would go out there barefoot and I would have my feet in the dirt, and the way my hands would smell, I felt more calm, and I felt after a while that I always had really bad skin. I felt like my skin got better. I felt like my breathing was better. I've never really been a very allergic person or anything, but I just noticed that my skin just felt better. And I was like, there's something to this. There's got to be something. And I had decided to grow organic tomatoes, and I had heirloom tomatoes, and I've never liked tomatoes in my life, ever. But when you grow a Cherokee purple tomato and you cut it open and put a couple flakes of salt on it and you taste it, you go, what have we been doing all this time? Or if you go to Europe or Australia where they don't have GMO tomatoes, it's a completely different experience. And you know, even in a little cafe that's not a gourmet place, you might take a bite of something and think that's the most delicious tomato I've ever had. Or if you have a strawberry in England, it tastes nothing like a strawberry here. It's like an explosion, and it's like a connection to an older world and an older time.
Yeah.
And so the more I hung around tomatoes, the more I kind of researched, you know, old varieties, and, you know, they're just not really that hard to grow. They just, if you give them just a little bit of trimming on the bottom and whatnot, they will just work with you. And, you know, I'm addicted to touching the leaves and then going. So that was pretty much how, and then from there I just branched out into other flowers and vegetables, and then native grasses and trees and food for pollinators.
Well, there's something because Rebecca and I have chatted. We both read your memoir, which is exquisite, and I was struck by something that you say about how you felt from an early age that you and nature shared a secret, and I think that kind of echoes something I've heard you say. So I just wonder if that's like something that was at what point that you started cultivating that sense.
I mean, for me, you know, I really relate to the way that you talk about plants and animals especially. It seems like you're not just aware of them, but you're actually kind of friends with them, or at least compatriots. And I have that relationship with the world myself, and I have a theory about why that might be. Because I grew up on a small farm in Connecticut, And in very different circumstances to yours, but I grew up just completely feral. And I can't say, I have to be careful what I say because my dad is in the audience, but I was able to like go into the woods for the whole afternoon when I was like 7, you know? And as a mom now, I had a level of freedom that just terrifies me. But it allowed me to form real relationships with moles and magnolias and spring ephemerals. And yeah, it just makes me wonder if children left to their own devices are naturally inclined to recognize animals as people and trees as living beings worthy of reverence, but that they get trained and are often trained in order to objectify the natural world, and see all of these incredible creatures as organisms that are there to be exploited. And then when you, of course, look at the world today, the economy, it's not difficult to see how these systems rely on relationships like that are based on exploitation. But I just wonder if maybe you missed that sort of like imperial indoctrination when you were little, and if you feel like maybe that's part of your story, or if your close relationship with plants and animals is just something that was within you.
Well, I was very unsupervised, and so I didn't, like, we lived so, my stepfather was an archaeologist, and we often lived in very, very, very rural places. And at one point we lived on the Colville Nation in eastern Washington, and we didn't have a phone, we didn't have television, and you couldn't even get radio stations there. And so I was left alone most of the day, every day, and I didn't have anybody telling me what I was supposed to think about trees or birds or bugs. And so I kind of formed my own ideas about that. Meanwhile, when I would be with my dad, my biological dad, because my parents were divorced, things were a little more empirical, but I also, my father was a huge animal lover, and we watched a lot of nature shows, and there was a lot of, you know, I hope that David Attenborough never dies. He keeps saying he's going to, but, you know, I'm really rooting for him to go to like 110. But, you know, the idea that there should be this respect for nature. And then, along with that, my stepfather was working a lot with indigenous tribes in eastern Washington, and people just talked about things very differently, and it just wasn't far-fetched, the idea that we were part of nature, which we are animals, we are biological animals, and we talk a lot about instincts, and we watch, you know, countless beautiful documentaries about instinct and why animals do what they do. And we have instincts, but they're really dumbed down. And that sort of, you know, how do we exploit this or that is absolutely what does that. That's why we can't connect with each other. That's why we don't know where we are, I don't think. And we don't know why we're in a certain place. But it's so important to investigate all those things and go, okay, well, where am I on the map of me and the map of the world? And why is all these things happening? And how, you know, I was lucky enough to have a lot of different influences and a lot of different perspectives that weren't shoved down my throat as a kid. And so for me, it seems that trying to help nature do what it's already doing, it will amplify everything we do tenfold. So, you know, people are like, well, if you stop using straws, you know, it's not going to help anything. It's like, yeah, it actually will help stuff, you know. Yeah. It's plastic. It's not going anywhere. So if you, yeah, you really are unbelievably powerful. You really are. And I wish people knew that more and believed that more about themselves.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, I I really see this work as of ecological gardening, right? That's what I do, is like is really trying to drill down into where we are on planet Earth. And rather than imposing what we want onto the land, really learn from the land and think about ways that our gardens and our landscapes can be in conversation with the land, and more of a method of making land beautiful for people and functional for people, but also supporting plants and wildlife of that land. And it's a growing movement. It's like this huge operation that is happening, and it's really global at this point. Millions of people are planting native plants and photographing and identifying butterflies, and it's really incredible to see. You are a unicorn in that you are a rock star doing this as well. But really, this is this like massive, massive thing that people like me are trying to support. And so I guess I'm just so curious where that comes from, and how you ended up, photographing moths and putting them on the internet and planting flowers for native bees, how you got from tomatoes all the way over to that process.
Well, when I was a little girl, for a particular project my stepfather was working on, we had to relocate to Vermont. And I think that when we got to Vermont, the project was canceled because Reagan was in the White House, and so science was not really worth anything at that point. So he cut that program. And I remember just being a little kid, being feral, and I remember one day I walked into the forest. I was about 10 years old, I think. It was a sugar bush, and it was just before autumn, and I saw the trunks of all the trees, and I realized I'm supposed to be scared right now. But then I also had a tremendous feeling of peace and calm, like something was looking out for me, and like I was supposed to be there. And I was never afraid walking around in the woods. Everything just felt like such an adventure. And so later in my life, I always longed for Vermont in that way. I longed to go back to that landscape. And so in 2006, I bought a farm in Vermont and moved there. And so I started out trying to do things a little more as you would expect, like trying to mow lawns and stuff like that. And it's impossible to keep up with. You need the staff of people to do that. And, Jeff and I, we don't have that. So, we mow some things sometimes. But I would notice that when we didn't mow things, the amount of birds and bees and insects and animals in general would triple and quadruple. Yep. And I was like, okay, there's something to this. And, I have it's a very steep farm. It's on the side of a mountain, and, well, it's a hill, but it's a mountain in Vermont. And, we weren't haying the upper fields because it's just too dangerous. And so it became infested with milkweed, except for milkweed is the natural plant that wants to grow there. And we noticed massive, fluttering herds of monarch butterflies, because that's what they come to get. And I was like, okay, well, I shouldn't be mowing that anyway. The person who had the farm before me had sheep, and so they would just graze it all, and that was great. But I was like, okay, I think that's what's supposed to happen. That's what the land really wants to do. And I remember the first year after deciding to do that, going outside on a hot day and smelling the smell of hot milkweed, 40 acres of hot milkweed blowing off the mountain. And I started to cry. I couldn't believe what an incredible smell it was. And I was like, why don't people make perfume out of milkweed? This is the most incredible thing I've ever smelled. And I might cry now, thinking of it. Ruminating on it, I may just cry. And then there was so many other plants, and are so many other plants, and I'm a newbie, really. Like I'm a amateur that, you know, I believe that, you know, you can buy a farm, and you can quote unquote own it, but the government can take it from you at any time. Like, let's not kid ourselves. There's eminent domain. There's a million reasons they can decide it's not yours anymore. You don't buy something to stake off and keep other people out of. What you buy is the right to be the steward to that piece of land and to have life and to share or not share, but, you know, it's a big responsibility. Yeah. And I just try to go forward with that. So there, we do a little bit of maple sugaring, and we've done a little bit of, you know, it's called ecological logging, in that we take out some trees that makes room for some of the younger ash, because as you know, you probably know, there's an emerald ash borer problem. And the really important thing about the ash tree in New England is it is, you know, and I am not an Abenaki citizen, and so this is me secondhand saying it was the first person. And so it is a sacred duty to make sure that ash trees do not go extinct. And
can you explain that again?
Well, the ash tree, I don't know, I don't remember the story exactly, and I always get very nervous about it because I'm very concerned that I don't want to appropriate someone else's story and tell it incorrectly. But the ash tree is the first person to the Abenaki people, and they rely on it for a trillion things. And what they're best known for with it is probably basket making and, you know, snowshoe making, which is incredible. And I took a lot of classes online from Abenaki elders about horticulture and about why these plants were so important. And so I realized there's got to be something that we can do about the emerald ash borer besides just cut down your trees, because that's what they have you do in Vermont. You should cut them down so they don't smash your house. It's like, okay, that's great, but trees talk to each other, so what if some of these older trees have something to say to the other trees? Like, that sounds stupid to people, but I don't give a rat's ass, because I trust the Abenaki way more than I trust empirical science. The trees give knowledge to the other trees, and the younger trees are still growing. And so you know, I don't know if my opinion matters at all, but I go out there and I notice what blooms with what and when. Mm-hmm. And I noticed that all of my really healthy ash trees have pagoda dogwood trees growing underneath them. And the pagoda dogwood trees bring in, you know, a vast number of birds, especially the pileated woodpecker. And so I'm wondering if there is some sort of correlation between healthy ash trees and pagoda dogwood trees, both of which are native to this particular region. And, you know, I'm not a scientist, but I'm obsessed with it, obviously, and I'm telling you now, but I'm just hoping that on my own land, I can help figure out what it is about young ash trees and ash trees that survive to a certain age that will help them, you know, live through this scourge, because the emerald ash borer is wiping out ash trees from Michigan.
If you drive out to Rochester, I've heard it just looks like a ghost forest, just, you know,
yeah,
dead ash trees everywhere.
Yeah.
So you have emerald ash borer on your land in your forest, but there are certain trees that are unaffected.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying? I mean, that's pretty incredible. Are you talking to researchers about that?
I don't have any researchers.
There's one to your left.
I don't have any personal
I'll put you in touch with
researchers.
some people. I mean,
Okay.
people are actively looking for trees that might be resistant, right, and trying to breed them. So,
Well, tell them to come over,
I will.
because
I
I
will.
cannot wait.
Yeah.
And, you know, the folks I know who are acoustic Abenaki would love to know that too.
yeah.
And they really, really care about the tree surviving. It's such a big deal. Yeah. And then all the other species that go with it. And so, can I ask you a question? What sort of plant or ecological thing that you maybe can't get your hand on or that you can't quite fix, what problem, kind of like maybe the emerald ash borer, obsesses you?
that I can't fix is
Well, you might be able to fix it, but you're still like, you're in the super clenchy part, like, I gotta figure this out.
I mean, I think the thing that I'm most passionate about is taking care of land and trying to, I mean, I see, when I look at native plants, when I look at plants that evolved on the land, I consider this to be their land, right? And I'm just trying to make space for them and for these ancient relationships that have been here for thousands and thousands of years. And I consider it an honor to be able to support that. And so I'm constantly trying right now to figure out ways to grow this movement, which I care a lot about, which is ecological gardening, without relying on the market system, without trying to make everyone go to box stores to buy plants. And what is the method for allowing people access to plants to care for the land that doesn't involve commodification, essentially? And so that's something that I think a lot about. And one of the fun things that I'm doing right now at my house in Connecticut is it's really old. The house is 200 years old, and there's like a lawn, which is also 200 years old. You have to imagine that it's been there for centuries. And I've been digging holes like down into the soil, 6 inches down, 10 inches down, and just bringing up soil and then putting it in seed trays and seeing what germinates. And I'm hoping that I can find plants that it's like you can travel back in time, right? And just see what has been in this soil over the years, and then to allow it to grow back on that land is really what I'm trying to do now. So it's not a problem. I mean, it is a constant thing, right? How to grow this movement without turning it into a trend or something that people feel like they can buy, right? A lot of times gardening becomes something that a garden is like a thing people want to have, or meadows are really trendy. I'm much more interested in supporting people's relationships with the natural world and trying to encourage people to really step into their role as caretakers of the land and see themselves as people who can help, rather than, I think there's a lot of, especially in ecology, there's a lot of people who are like, people are cancer, like the sooner the meteor gets here, the better. And I just find that stuff so tragic that when you look around, there's so many cultures, so many instances all throughout history, so many people who have had sustainable relationships with the planet in such marvelous ways, and it's not our species necessarily that is the problem right now. It's very specific cultural elements that need not be what we carry into the future. And so that's what I'm constantly grappling with, beyond just like supporting specific butterflies and moths, which is what else I do.
Well, Neko, you were starting to hint at a concept that comes up a lot in your work, which is the idea of symbiosis. At least that's what I took from the dogwood and ash tree growing next to one another. And in your TED Talk, which I suggest everyone look at, it's called Let Your Garden Grow Wild, right? You bring up this relationship between the eastern columbine. Now, this is a native plant, yes?
Yep.
So you can express this much better than I.
Sure. So this is one of my favorite flowers and one of my favorite stories to tell. So flowers are the most beautiful things on earth, right? And we love them. And they're trying to be alluring. They're trying to be attractive. But the reality is that we're not their target audience. They are putting on this marvelous show for their pollinator partners, who are the bees and butterflies and birds and occasionally a lizard, who have partnered with these plants in order to take the pollen from one of the flowers and carry it over to the receptive stigma of another flower. And so it's like the plants have literally outsourced sex, and they're relying on these. Most flowers do this. About 80% of flowers do this. We, thank goodness, do it inside our bodies. Flowers often do it flying through the air on the face of a bumblebee. And so the flowers are the advertisements for these. They're saying, come and drink some nectar, come and get some pollen, or be tricked into doing this service for us. But the really fun thing about it is that the flowers don't just wake up one day and decide that this is what they're going to look like, this is what they're going to smell like. They have worked with these pollinators for thousands and thousands of years in order to end up in the shapes and the scents that we all love so much. So, for instance, if there's a bumblebee that is a fantastic pollinator, and they happen to like a specific color of pink, and they go to a flower and they pollinate that flower is going to be fertilized and reproduce more than other flowers, and you'll end up with that color pink flowers. And when you consider the ramifications of that over time, you end up with the reality that flowers are really the manifested desires of their pollinator partners. That when you look and when you smell a rose, you are really, you have bees to thank for that, and you can look at phlox and thank butterflies and moths for what they've done over time. And so for this flower, looking at this flower, this is Ecology canadensis, and I know just by looking at it, even if I wasn't familiar, I could say that this is hummingbird pollinated, and that's because it's red. And hummingbirds, we have 3 cones in our eyes, and we can see the visual spectrum that we see. And bees also have 3 cones in their eyes, but they're shifted over into the UV spectrum. And so they can see ultraviolet colors we can only dream of, but they can't see red. Or they can't, so we think that they can't differentiate between red and green. Whereas birds have 4 photoreceptors in their eyes, and they can see a little bit into the UV spectrum, but way more into the red spectrum than we can see. And so these flowers are essentially saying to birds, I am for you. They're using that color to communicate with birds. And even everything about the shape of this flower, if you look at the shape of the flower, there's a spur on the flower and a nectar bulb, and it's really been formed perfectly for the beak of the ruby-throated hummingbird, which is this region's only hummingbird. And other animals can do something called nectar robbing, where they will bite a hole in that spur and drink the nectar, but only the ruby-throated hummingbird is able to pollinate that flower. And so it's just such a more beautiful thing when you look at a flower and say, oh, this is pretty, to understand these relationships and what is happening behind them and be able to encourage them. I love growing this flower because when it blooms in the spring, I know that the ruby-throated hummingbirds are about to come to my region, that they overwinter in Mexico and Costa Rica, and then they fly over the Gulf of Mexico, and as they get to Texas, they're greeted by all of these red flowers. And then as they fly north, this wave of red flowers blooms to meet them. And again, that's just like, it's so much better when I'm gardening to use plants that are tapped into all these incredible dynamics that are ancient dynamics, rather than just thinking about what goes with my house or what I really like, to really be a part of these ecological communities and support them.
So the primary motivation to let your garden grow wild is to create a habitat that's more inviting to pollinators.
Yes.
Is that right?
I mean, it's pollinators, but it's so much more than that as well, right? And the biodiversity crisis that we're all facing right now has to do with so many different types of animals and plants and fungi. And so it's about pollinators, it's about insects, it's about birds, it's about, spiders, right? And the reality is that we are currently, just over the last few decades, we've lost nearly half of insects on planet Earth, and we're expected to lose another third over the next 20 years. And when you look at these big webs, these food webs, insects are what feeds so many other organisms. They're a bellwether of ecological health. And so 96% of terrestrial birds in North America feed their young exclusively on insects. So as those insects decline, so do birds. And so right now we've lost about a third of birds over the last few decades as well. So it's really important. It's not just pollinators. Pollinators are beautiful and wonderful, and pollination ecology is probably the most fascinating thing I can possibly imagine. But from a perspective of global well-being, it really is, you know, even very non-romantic animals like centipedes and fish.
So, and Neko, these are two pictures. I mean, I'm sure they're dated at this point, but I'm curious, when these parts of your garden that you've let grow wild, what were you following any sort of prescription to do it, or?
Nope. I just let them go. I asked you earlier what you're obsessed with as far as problematic things go. I'm obsessed with invasive species as far as plants. And so there's a couple spots on the farm where there's some Japanese knotweed, which creates monocultures, which is one of the things that you're talking about, where there's a plant that will be from another continent that doesn't have any predators here and nothing that pollinates it, but it can grow on its own, and Japanese knotweed, pampas grass, so many other things. I see them everywhere. And especially since in about 2011, with Hurricane Irene, Vermont started flooding heavily pretty much every year. And so what would happen is there would be little pockets of these invasive plants, and unfortunately water really helps them spread. So, and they spread from rhizomes in the roots, and they have taken over most of the riverbanks in the county where I live. And it's been in a very short period of time. And so I see, the Japanese knotweed every day, and I'm immediately clenching. And every time the county comes through and mows the side of the road, they spread it. And then the flooding spreads it. And so pretty soon there will be no riverbank left. There will be a riverbank, but the only thing that's going to grow there is Japanese knotweed. And that will be the only thing that grows there. And Japanese knotweed is beautiful and gorgeous, and everyone's like, no, my cows eat it. Their cows don't eat it. Nothing eats it. So, then you're stuck with, well, should I spray a bunch of poisons on this plant right next to the river? No. It's an incredibly hard plant to eradicate. And I don't know if you've ever flown over or driven to where Newark Airport is in New York City, or how many of you ever watched The Sopranos, where they would take the dead body to this place where there was all this blowing, beautiful grass. Like, there are probably 600 acres of nothing but pampas grass on the waterways down there, and it scares the living shit out of me when I see it. I feel like I'm watching The Shining, and I just want to do something about it so bad all the time. And so basically that's my boogeyman under the bed, is invasive species plants.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. I think my latest sort of Zen approach to managing plants like that is to really dig into the history of each plant, and rather than seeing them as sort of like an evil invader, which I definitely went through a phase where the scales fell from my eyes and I just saw all of this like destroyed land, and it filled me with rage. Now for a lot of plants, like garlic mustard and Queen Anne's lace and broadleaf plantain, I've been learning their stories.
Is Queen Anne's lace not native?
Nope, it's not.
I didn't know that.
No, it was a fascinating plant. It was brought over by Europeans because the seeds were an abortifactant. Mm-hmm. And so it's like a really important method of managing health and reproduction.
Write that down.
I know, right? And then it jumped out of cultivation and spread around.
Escaped cultivation is one of my favorite terms of all time, by the way. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No,
Keep going.
It's great. It's great. But yeah, like learning their stories, learning how they got here, learning how I can appreciate them and use them in my cooking while removing them, right? If they're causing ecological damage, remove them. But how can I also appreciate them while I'm doing that? Like there's so many plants that were brought over as medicines, and sometimes I see, I worry sometimes that my advocacy of native plants and whatnot could be misinterpreted as sort of like papering over a very complicated history of environmental and indigenous destruction and that real history that we need to grapple with, right? It's not about just planting flowers, it's about looking at why these things happened, why you have the banks of a river getting overrun with this one plant. And so yeah, it makes this new perspective for me, it makes it easier to do that work. Like, yes, remove them, absolutely, when they're causing damage, get it out however you have to, but also appreciate the history and how they got here and what they're used for.
Yes. I definitely don't hate the plants either. Yeah. I'm just like, whoa, oh, I feel all. And I also realize, like, I'm only looking at it from one direction. So one day I decided I'm going to look up which North American continent plants are invasive in Asia.
Yeah.
And it's exactly the same there.
Yeah.
There's so many North American species that are ravaging, countrysides in China, or
goldenrod,
ragweed. What is it? Water hyacinth from South America has choked out a lot of waterways in Asia. So it's a totally global problem.
I sort of think of it as like environmental entropy, right? Like there was this order for a while where different systems were able to develop these levels of complexity, and now we're just stirring it all up, and moving everything over, and we're missing that sense of order that evolved.
I mean, will it always stay a monoculture?
I mean, theoretically, no, right? Like the problem with these plants when they move, they're in a place that they have predators, they have environmental pressures that keep them limited, and then they go into a new place and they don't have any of those pressures. And occasionally, yes, you do see them develop that over centuries, right? Sometimes it can take decades. Often it takes a really long time. And there are people who advocate that we're just thinking on the wrong scale and that this is fine. I do not feel that way. I think that there is so much happening right now that is causing hardship for wildlife, for plants, for the people who live with these plants and animals, that to just sort of allow this mixing and this level of destruction, and then to say, oh, it'll take care of itself in a century, even if we lose, multiple species of butterflies to do that. That to me feels, like giving up. And I see our responsibility as caretakers of the land, and that we can and should do something, that people who own land or care for land, that's a real responsibility. I think a lot of people don't know how to take care of land anymore. They mow because they don't know anything else. They put shrubs that they can buy at box stores because they don't know anything else to do with their land, and they're kind of scared of what happens when you stop mowing. I think a lot of people are literally terrified to stop mowing their lawns.
Yeah. I've been terrified to stop mowing too. And another thing that happens is there's a lot of intensely invasive vegetation that you can just go buy at a nursery. Yep. There's no regulation or warning that tells you you shouldn't buy a burning bush plant and plant it in Vermont out in your yard, or Veronica, or a million other things, Japanese barberry, but you can buy them anywhere. So of course nobody knows that, you're not supposed to do that, or you shouldn't do that, but because nobody educates anyone about it.
So that to me is criminal, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's very different. Like a lot of these plants came in, people scared on boats, enslaved people literally sewing seeds into their hair, brought some of these plants over and they spread out onto the land. And to me, that's like the history of this land. But when I look at the way that the horticultural trade is spreading plants that are known to cause damage, that to me is worth, protests and yelling and especially things like barberry that supports the ticks that cause Lyme disease and stuff like that. That drives me absolutely crazy.
Well, you touch on this in the end of your TED Talk about gardening as not just as being therapeutic, but also a form of activism, even if it's a private form of activism. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So gardens are super important. A lot of people think that they're just there to be pretty, but they serve incredibly important functions in the world and really always have. And you have, right now people are using gardening to really help address environmental injustice, redlining, climate change, literally, all of these big things. There are gardens that are really addressing those problems. And there was a study out of Philadelphia about a decade ago where they went into really underserved communities and they took vacant lots and they put in parks and gardens in these lots, and they found that just in the region of those parks that gun crime went down 29%. And so, and then there was another study out of Finland just a few years ago now where they had daycares, and they went into the daycares and they ripped up a bunch of concrete and asphalt in parking lots and play spaces, and they put in gardens and raised beds and trees, and they saw the immune system function of kids just skyrocket.
Wow.
As a result of having access to healthy soils, because that's how microbiomes work, right?
Quick footnote, this is one of your great horticulture successes. I'll let you tell what you did here.
Oh, sure. So this is Brooklyn Bridge Park, which is an 85-acre post-industrial park built on reclaimed shipping piers off the coast of Brooklyn. And it was designed by Michael van Valkenburg, and I worked there. I was director of horticulture from right when it first opened until we finished it 11 years later. And so I oversaw and I watched this humongous transformation from these industrial piers, which are just big slabs of concrete. It's like a parking lot. And I watched them turned into incredible ecosystems that were not like a normal park. I was a gardener for the Parks Department for years before this, and people consider a park like a tree and a lawn and a bench. And this was like salt marshes and meadows and forests, and it was always intended to be biodiverse, but it was really incredible what we saw happening over the years that I was there. It just absolutely flourished. We saw stick bugs and lightning bugs and critically imperiled bumblebees and a ladybug that hadn't been seen in New York State in 30 years just came to that landscape and found it there. And then we developed techniques to encourage various species of butterflies as well through planting and pruning and whatnot. And it just worked, right? It was so fast and so possible. And it brings me a lot of hope, because if we were able to do this in the harshest environment imaginable, in fake soils, like wedged between a highway and a river and lower Manhattan, it really shows what's possible elsewhere when you have real soils or in a more verdant community. So, I do think that if we ever did decide to, get out of this tailspin of biological decline, there are techniques and there are ways to care for the earth and care for land and even retrofit it back into cities if we wanted to do that.
It's a beautiful park. I've been there. It's really stunning.
Well, we know you've been there because you were trespassing there with a
Oh,
New York
yeah.
Times.
That's right. That's right.
Maybe you could turn a blind eye to that. Great.
That was so fun. I was looking up photos for this, and I was like, I recognize that plant combination.
You're like, get that asshole lady out of my plants.
We'll allow it. We'll allow it in this one instance.
We're going to take some questions from the audience, but I do just want to wrap up this point that I brought up because you talk about, and you put it so beautifully in the TED Talk, just about the experience of cultivating life with your two hands, how that can bring hope. And there's a through line I see in your memoir where you talk, I'm going to read a direct quote here, living the small rebellion against nothingness and corruption is what helps you exist at all in such a divided country. You know, and I don't know if you were referring to actually your land stewardship in the
Always
context.
referring to the land.
Yes, okay.
And everything else, but it's always the number one thing in my heart, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think I really get immobilized with the horrors of the world and climate change and biodiversity collapse, and like fascism is on the march, and oftentimes like the official response for what to do is like recycle, and it just doesn't feel real or impactful. And this work of taking care of land, it really inspires me, and I'd love to see more people doing it because it's like it ties people back into these relationships, and it gives them a sense of belonging that I think we're taught not to have, very specifically taught not to have. And yeah, and I think we're also sort of, we've learned that the methods of social change and political change come through things like voting every 4 years. And when you just go outside and plant plants and you're supporting the ecology that is like literally your community, right? You become part, you entangle yourself within your ecological community. That to me is super radical. That's where it becomes activism for me, is where people aren't waiting on anybody else to solve these problems. They can go out and take action. It's like direct action, right? Like the prettiest form of direct action possible, which is supporting the plants and the butterflies that are just all around us. And the rewards come so quickly and so beautifully. It's pretty profound.
So this is related from a member of the audience. Living in a city like Boston, I look out my window and see more concrete than soil. What do you recommend for fostering ecological connections and gardening in an environment where ecologies feel siloed?
So there was a study out of Chicago just a couple years ago, and they found that pots of milkweed on a rooftop or a balcony can actually support monarch butterflies. There is no such thing as a gesture that is too small for this work. You can absolutely support these systems literally just by placing whatever native plant that you happen to find or would like to grow or think is super cool. It is absolutely possible. You can also volunteer at a park. You can, join a community garden. There are plenty of collective places to garden as well. But in general, cities need less concrete, more greenery. That's for damn sure.
And then also, I think some people are looking for some more nuts and bolts advice. This is from Karen. Neko, I once wanted to cook but didn't know where to start until I watched your tutorial for making borscht. I now want to garden but don't know where to start. Help.
Okay, so the easiest thing to do is look up which species of milkweeds and asters and goldenrods are native to where you are and plant them. That's like the starter pack, right? You're supporting a butterfly in its ability to lay eggs and eat leaves as a caterpillar, and then also nectar as an adult. And so the milkweed supports monarchs when they're babies, when they're caterpillars, and the asters and the goldenrods will support many, many animals. You can just watch them. There are a few plants. There are a few other plants that I think are really wonderful beginner plants. There's mountain mint, is the single most popular plant for pollinators that I've ever seen. It's incredible how popular it is among all different types of pollinators, and there's definitely a mountain mint that is native to wherever you live in North America. And then there's this wonderful plant called Pearly Everlasting that I like to promote as well, because it is the host plant for the American lady butterfly, and they show up instantly when you plant it. Monarchs are struggling right now. They're having a really hard time. You can plant milkweed and maybe you'll get them, maybe you won't, but American lady butterflies show up pretty quick. And so especially with kids, I like to have that one immediately.
Okay.
Yeah, or even if you feel like there's a plant that you think is beautiful or a vegetable you really like, you could just start with one thing in your kitchen and put it on your windowsill and just see what it does. It is really addictive, I think. I started with tomato plants in Vermont, and I ended up with probably like 400, and then I I ended up just giving all these tomatoes to restaurants locally. But some of the pollinator plants, that the milkweed is number one, like you said, Pearly Everlasting, fantastic. I find that the most exciting for the native bees that I have, they like, I don't know if this is native, but Phacelia.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Phacelia is great.
And they love Culver's root, which is native. And Culver's root is so dramatic and elegant and tall. And Phacelia smells incredible. It smells kind of in the realm of the milkweed, you know, ethereal, like, I can't believe I'm smelling this. This is the most incredible planet in the world feeling.
Okay, this is from Anonymous. Where in nature do you find the most inspiration for song lyrics or melodies?
I think it's the first place that I find all the inspiration. So it's kind of the deepest part of the well, really. So you know how where you grow up kind of, like if you think of a tree, in your mind, you have a picture dictionary in your mind from when you're a kid, and maybe the first thing you see is a maple. I see a Douglas fir. I grew up in Washington State, so the Douglas fir is my tree. I have little picture dictionaries that are interwoven with stories and anecdotes that are just like this giant complex brain that lives inside my brain also. I don't really know how to describe it, but everything that I think about or do is somehow connected to nature. It's kind of like how the Greeks invented the pantheon of gods to be able to, you know, talk about human behavior, and like, here's a story that's similar to the problem that you're going through. I have all those stories are kind of in different kinds of biology, I think, in different kinds of plants and animals and weather events and movements of planets or whatever the whole thing is. And I just trust it.
That was kind of a 2-for-1 answer, because Trina said, love your autobiography, Neko. What plants have you brought with you from the Pacific Northwest, whether live or in song or memory? The fir.
Well, I think a lot about Western forests, and especially most of my family lived in the northwestern corner of Washington State near Mount Baker, which is kind of semi-rainforest, and that soft, squishy forest floor and deep needle floor is something that feels very ancient and connected to me. But then when I came to Vermont, I think the forests were more similar to something that I actually experienced in an ancient way, being Eastern European. They're more similar to that, and grasslands, etc. And so there was something very familiar about them somehow.
How can we get kids excited about protecting and fighting for nature without being depressing or scary?
I mean, planting flowers that attract butterflies is a great way to do it. I like to tell kids stories about certain plants that are cool or gross, And as I think that, the plants that I learned about when I was little, they often were Queen Anne's lace and buttercups, and as all of my ancestors were immigrants, and so most of those stories are of plants that are also immigrants. And so I am always paying attention to the stories of plants from here that I can share with kids as well that they might be interested in, like skunk cabbage. If you know of the skunk cabbage flower, it's like maroon and it blooms in March. It's this incredible flower, and it smells disgusting and is fly pollinated, and it's literally a meat mimic so that the flies think that they're laying their eggs on rotting meat, and I find that kids love that stuff.
I do too.
Yeah.
We've got time for one more question. This is for both of you to discuss. From one feral, neglected child to another, do you think animals in nature chose us, or do we choose to develop magical relationships with wild nature?
Well, I think we've been disrupted from our instincts, like I was saying earlier. I was lucky in that I was not told what to think about nature, but then later in my life, I grew up in this country, in the school system here, and with this culture, and so I did start to think of myself as a separate. And I was definitely one of those people who you mentioned earlier who was very pessimistic about human beings. And I didn't want the comet, but I thought we should stop having children and have a soft extinction. It's the least we could do. But it was a really easy, cheap way to, and it was just too cynical, it was too cheap and easy. And then I read the book by Robin Wall Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass, and I'm gonna start crying because that's what I do. I felt actually useful for the first time as a human being, thanks to her. And just, if you've never read it, I would highly recommend it. It will make you feel like, oh, there's totally a hope for this world, especially if we really examine and respect the indigenous people's way. They're still here. They still have these connections and this expertise about how we can bring these plants back and how ecology can be fixed. And, that can be joined with empirical science, and it can be a really beautiful relationship. And also my stepfather, who was my one really great parent, always was in between those two worlds. Like, science is great, and, native learning is great. And he told me a story the other day. He's from Western Massachusetts. He's from Adams. And he said, back in the days of the textile mills, when he was a kid, there was a bunch of streams that you wouldn't stick your toe in. You wouldn't dare, because it was known to be acidic and it was known to be poisonous, and there was nothing growing in there. And the kids were afraid of the water. And he said that now there's actually salmon in some of these streams again. And he teared up. He was like, it is just so beautiful that this can happen. And he's like, I didn't think that would happen in my lifetime. He's only 76, He always says he's old, but I don't think that's old. And so I don't even remember what the question was. I just went on so long.
Well, it was all great.
It was about,
going.
yeah, it was beautiful. It was about relationships and like how you build these relationships with the natural world, and whether or not they pick you or you pick them. And I think, just as you were saying, you have to work at these relationships. It's just like any sort of relationship. And like right now I'm trying to befriend these 3 crows that live in the forest behind my house. I'm like working at it. And we are estranged right now. So many people are estranged from these relationships. You just need that curiosity, that goodwill, that intent to help. And you can so often just be welcomed right back in.
Did you give him eggs?
Did I what?
Eggs?
No,
They
is
love
that a
eggs.
thing? Okay, thank you.
They really need the
Okay.
calcium at certain times of the year. They love
Okay.
eggs.
All right,
Try it.
awesome. I will.
Befriend a crow. I need to make a quick plug, if I may.
Plug
You are
it.
coming back here at the Wilbur on October 23rd, okay? So, and you've got a new album coming out, Neon Gray, Midnight Green, colors being the through line here. So thanks again to Rebecca McMackin and Neko Case.
Thank you, Matt.
Please join us. We're going to have a reception right here in the Blue Wing. Thank you so much to the Museum of Science. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.